speaking of absurdly ignorant or intentionally divisive, I have to touch on this briefly. A lot of people have asked me to. Sam Harris, who I thankfully is generally a much less relevant person to speak about now. I think that, it's really become clear that the people that are part of that cult are part of that cult, and everybody else who sort of has some interest in actually grappling with issues is not going to find the sort of, this kind of one-dimensional hyperventilating particularly enlightening. And I've always made the point that the fundamental problem, too, is not just that the policy is wrong, not just that the statements are sweeping and bigoted and stupid, which they are, but also that this new atheist cult sliding through the gamer thing and the alt-right and everything else, in some ways you could read as a mass collapse in liberal arts education or training in humanities or reading comprehension. It's very analogous. A lot of people have been talking about Steve Bannon in The Fourth Turning. It's this sort of pseudo-historical book that claims that, history moves through these different cycles. They're predetermined. They're barely even materially influenced. They're almost more like a metaphysical process. And even though, of course, Harris is a supposedly great empiricist, the same desire of a certain type of autodidact to have the whole world explained to them in an easily digestible format so that there's no answers, there's no questions, there's no ambiguity. There's just, we have a rationality, bad, rationality is good. People in Bangladesh listen to a Sam Harris blog or a podcast and the world's problems are solved, right? This is also a line of thinking that seeps very easily into, IQ tests show this. Well, IQ tests don't actually show much. They're very culturally dependent. They have been shown to change at different times that they're administrated on people. And there's a lot of research questioning IQ, something that I'm not going to dive into, but it's not a fixed, immutable thing. When you're talking about human intelligence, you're not talking about eye color. It is a far more complex enterprise that is culturally determined, it's innate, it's genetically, environmentally influenced, and everything else. But we've seen a rise with the alt-right of this return of pseudoscientific racism. And the Bible of pseudoscientific racism is the bell curve written by a really extraordinary scumbag by the name of Charles Murray, who's a loathsome, disgusting human being. And he co-wrote the bell curve with a guy named Charles Bernstein, who was a professor at Harvard. The relevant part of the bell curve is that it came out in the 1990s. It purported to show that Black and Hispanic people were less intelligent than whites, according to IQ distribution, and Asians were smarter than whites, in fact. And the policy upshot of the book, and this was actually the really important thing, the policy upshot of the book was that we should slash things like welfare. There's nothing that can be done by government intervention because it's basically, we're destined to have an unequal society through cognitive predestination, most of which, or some of which, is racially determined. So there was the version on the right which made the cultural version of this argument, which is that, and this is very broad based on the right, all throughout, whether it's expressed in a soft or harsh way. But, it's not that people of color are genetically inferior. It's just that their cultures are pathological. And therefore, again, we can condescend to them. We can brutalize them with policing. We don't have to invest in overturning, and again, not just slavery, mass land theft, apartheid, Jim Crow, redlining, wealth transfers, police murder, abuse, formal and informal segregation. No, it's just they listen to rap music, they have sex when they shouldn't, or they're genetically inferior. So this was the genetically inferior track, and Andrew Sullivan insisted on publishing it in the New Republic. Now, I've already given the sort of more fair-minded critique of this book, which is questioning the methodology to begin with. But what also, in terms of the substance, but what also emerged is that Murray and Bernstein used sources in the bell curve, and I'm quoting now, around genetic inferiority that were found, basically studies and received funding and research from the Pioneer Fund, who generously funded a guy named Richard Lynn, a man who Murray heavily referenced in his book, and who also claimed evolutionary progress means the extinction of the less competent non-whites. To think otherwise is sentimentality, end quote. So Murray's work basically posed as scholarship what relied on research from groups like the Pioneer Fund that had an explicitly neo-eugenics and neo-Nazi ideology. So even setting aside the quote-unquote mainstream science of IQ, the whole research itself was riddled with and reliant on overtly junk science and racist sources. And I would also recommend the Shame Project, which Mark Ames put together, which goes into everything from Charles Murray, who in his high school years, the height of the civil rights movement, burned a cross on his town, on a hill in a small town in Iowa. And he later claimed that he had no idea what cross burning meant. Apparently, he has some IQ challenges of his own.
It's the cultural part of the IQ thing that he was missing.
Yeah, he was missing that cultural intelligence.
Just to go back to what we were saying about sort of the Heritage Foundation and all these sort of right-wing think tanks, that is what Charles Murray is a product of.
He's a pure product of that.
1981, he started the Manhattan Institute, where he wrote Losing Ground, which is like an anti sort of Great Society book.
That's right.
And then in 1990, I believe, since 1990, he's been a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And that's how these guys
And he is subsidized to create junk pseudoscience to justify decimating the social safety net, attacking poor people and people of color. Because his new work, actually his most recent work, which was, you said the one in 1981 was called Losing Ground?
The one in the 80s was Losing Ground.
I think this new work is called Coming Apart, which focuses on the white working class. And because now there needed to be, if it can't just be racism, he needs to explain why with the increase of inequality, all of these supposedly cultural or genetic determined problems are happening to white people. And of course, we would never accept just the economic and material realities of it. Now there needs to be, goes back to the cultural explanation, to trash poor white people. So he is subsidized by these places as a handmaiden to create pseudoscience to attack people's well-being and destroy things that work in American government. And he's, by the way, not just loved by the alt-right. Jeb Bush praised him before he ran for president.
It's a lesson of our time that
David Brooks has praised him.
Money allows bullshit to defy gravity.
Exactly. Why have we ever even heard of libertarianism? And his other thing that's worth noting was that, and I'm just quoting that from the Shame Project, Murray spent the peak Vietnam War years in Thailand, first with the Peace Corps, and then from 1968 onward in a Pentagon-contracted counterinsurgency program run by the American Institute for Research, which operated under the cover of anthropological research. In 1970, the New York Review of Books exposed that the air program in Thailand, where Murray worked as a covert military counterinsurgency program run by the Defense Department and development agents and CIA by the Defense Department's Research and Development Agency, ARPA, in cooperation with the CIA. And that was involved with assassination programs and neutralization of other measures. And Murray admitted later on that his experience there influenced his advocacy of zero tolerance policies to law enforcement. So, and of course, he calls Social Security a Ponzi scheme. He says all schools should be privatized, but also has endorsed the surveillance state and said that one of the great things about inequality is that it makes it harder for politicians to bash the rich. So, Sam Harris put out a podcast called Forbidden Knowledge, where he had a nice conversation for a couple of hours with Charles Murray. I didn't listen to it. I'm not interested in a free exchange of ideas. Fuck all of those people.
Record! Congratulations!